In addition to Segal, I need to thank my partner and partner in crime, Judy Jacobs, who's been very helpful in helping to set up these the various videos and slides for the presentation. So I'm going to start, before I get into the actual talk, I'm just going to do a short introduction about rescuers, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about my parents' personal story. And then after that, we will get into the first of the three periods I'm going to talk about, 1933 to 39. Second one is going to be 39 to 45, the war years. And then the last part of the talk will be devoted to the period after the war and what it means to be rescued at the end of the war and after the war. So the first thing I think it's important to understand is the subject matter of today is a little bit different than the subject matter of the last two talks, because today's talk really raises serious questions about life, and they're really, in a sense, existential questions. They involve questions like, if somebody approached me to help them save their life or the lives of their family or a member of their family, and I did so at the risk of my own life or the life of members of my family, would I do it? Why would I do it? And the same question applies to all of us. We could all be faced with those kinds of questions. And of course, the question for the people seeking rescue is, who do I go to? Who do I think might be able to help me? Will it have to be somebody I know well? Can it be a stranger? These are all questions that obviously faced Jews in Europe after the Nazis came to power. And I think those are questions you need to keep in mind when you hear the stories of the rescuers I'm going to talk about. Now, obviously, I can't talk about all of the rescuers. That'll become apparent as we go through this talk. But they are questions that really apply to all those involved in rescues and all those who were rescued. So let me tell you a little bit about my parents' story. My parents were both Holocaust survivors. They grew up in the southwestern corner of Poland, in an area that some people refer to as Silesia. My mother came from a rather large city. At the time, there was 120,000 people in her town or city of Sosnowiec. About a quarter of the population was Jewish, and there were some illustrious individuals who grew up and lived in Sosnowiec. I will be talking about one of them. My father grew up in a small town about an hour northeast of Sosnowiec in a place called Olkusz. The town was approximately 7,500 people. A third of the population was Jewish. Olkusz, basically, the Jewish population was wiped out. Sosnowiec, there is still a Jewish population in Sosnowiec, but it's obviously very small. So my parents were in their late teens when the war started. In 1943, towards the end of the deportation of the Jews from Sosnowiec, my mother was put on a transport with her mother. Her father had died in 1941 of natural causes, together with a number of her siblings. She was at a family of 8 children. Her oldest brother was not on the transport, and an older sister was married and did not come with the family on that transport. So the family went obviously on a cattle car. The town they lived in, the city they lived in, was about an hour from Auschwitz itself. That journey took 3 days. Obviously in the middle of August or the beginning of August, they left on August 3rd and they arrived on August 6th. It would have been quite unbearably hot. And as we all know, there was no real food and very little water and virtually no sanitary conditions on the cattle car. When the train arrived in Auschwitz, of the 3,000 people, 2,500 were immediately sent to the gas chambers, including my mother and most of her siblings. Only one of her brothers was allowed to live, and in fact did survive the war along with my mother. My father's experience was different, but he also basically was taken to slave labor in about 1943. He was fortunate enough to be with his oldest brother for a period of time. And so when he developed typhus, which obviously was life-threatening, especially in those circumstances and those conditions. Somehow his brother pulled him through and he survived into 1945. And so I'm going to talk about the two situations in which they faced themselves, in which they were faced with, and the rescues in which they were involved. And they are not your sort of typical rescue situations. First of all, before my mother was transported, her oldest brother had a friend who was a nurse working in the Jewish hospital in Sosnovitz. And as the deportations were increasing, obviously it would be best if you could delay being transported to the camps as long as possible. So she actually got taken into the hospital on the basis that she had an appendix attack, and she was able to avoid at least one transport or deportation at that period of time, which possibly saved her life. One doesn't know. But her real rescue comes while she is in Auschwitz. She is working in the part of the camp called Canada. I don't know if people here have been to Auschwitz. Canada was the part of the camp named Canada because it was sort of the best kind of work you could get in Auschwitz, because you were working indoors and you were sorting clothes and other material that had been brought by the Jews transported to Auschwitz. And as we all know, upon arrival, women had their hair shorn. And of course, as they were there longer, their hair would grow back and they would have to be cut again. And I guess at some point in time, my mother got just too frustrated and too angry. And so when they came to cut her hair again, she grabbed the scissors from the guard. I don't know if she intended to kill the guard or not, but obviously she was stopped from attacking the guard by another guard. The guard from whom she had grabbed the scissors wanted to immediately take her out to the yard and have her hung because of her disobedience and her possible threat to the other guard's life. But the guard who stepped in convinced the other guard to not do that and to let my mother go, because my mother was a good worker. So that guard obviously saved my mother's life at that point in time. That's not your typical rescue, but it clearly saved her life. In the case of my father, he was in a labor camp with a friend of his who passed away a couple of years ago. And they were on, I guess, a death march. I don't have much of the details of that march, but there were about 50 Jewish slave laborers being guarded and marched by one German soldier. And at some point they stopped to rest, and his friend told my father, we need to try to escape because they're going to kill us. And my father, being less impetuous than my mother, was reluctant to do anything crazy, and initially said no, and eventually his friend convinced him to make a run for it. 5 of the men ran off into the woods. The guard tried to shoot them, but none of them were hit. The guard could not leave the other 45 men he was guarding, so basically they were able to escape. They found a hiding place in a building. They pulled the floorboards up from the floor of the building and hid underneath the floorboards. And during the few days that they were there, they did go out to try to find some food, but there were also shells going off around them. And a few days after they had escaped, some other men joined them in this building, finding them under the floorboards. And eventually they were found by members of the Soviet army, which terrified them terribly because they didn't know if the Soviets would be any better or even worse than the Nazis. So when they were approached and asked who they were, they tried to duck the question. They tried to not admit that they were Jews who had escaped from the Nazis, but eventually that came out. At that point, the commander of the troop walked up to them, unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of his uniform, showed them that he was wearing a Magen David, and told them, don't worry, you're safe. You just listen to what I tell you. You go east because we're going west. And that's how my father's life was saved at that point in time. That day, February 22nd of 1945, is a very special day, as you can imagine, in my family. So those are my parents' personal rescue stories. And they do raise the question of what does it mean to be a rescuer? Was the guard who intervened with my mother a rescuer? Was my father's friend who convinced him to run away a rescuer? Of course, in my mind, they both were rescuers, but it's not the way we normally think of rescuers in the Holocaust. So with those introductory remarks, I'm happy to start to talk about the period between 1933 and 1939, when it was still possible for at least some people to get out of Germany, to get out of Austria, and to get out of the parts of Czechoslovakia that had been handed over to Germany before the war actually started. Now, obviously, if you were well connected and wealthy, or you had an important skill, you could probably find your way out of Germany in particular at the time. The Germans were not trying to prevent people from leaving. The question was really in what circumstances you could leave, what you could take with you, and where could you go and who would accept you. And so the classic examples of the people who were able to leave, and there were obviously many who did leave, because by the time the war started, about 200,000 Jews had left Germany. The ones who had the easiest time getting out of Germany were those with important skills. A number of those were academics, well-recognized academics, and people who could find positions, academic positions in universities outside of Germany and hopefully in North America. And so we have people like Albert Einstein, who was able to depart and doesn't return to Germany. We have a number of physicists who ultimately manned the Manhattan Project, like Enrico Fermi from Italy. He's not Jewish, but his wife was Jewish and he decided to leave. And Leo Szilard, who's another physicist. So a number of these people were in fact able to leave. Edward Teller is another one, and made it to the United States and ultimately played a very important role in ensuring that the Allies would win the war, and especially win the war in the Pacific because they created the atom bomb. Many other people were unable to leave. Many of the peasants, certainly in Eastern Europe, and even the non-wealthy or not well-connected in Germany and Austria were not as successful in being able to leave. And there were a number of reasons for that. One is nobody wanted many of these people. The Americans in 1924, even before the Depression started, had passed a new Immigration Act, which limited immigration, which set up quotas for immigration from various countries. And so, for example, if there was a population of Jews in Poland, the quota would be 2% of the Jewish population at the time the Immigration Act was passed. And obviously for smaller communities, that was a very significant hindrance. And basically the Americans didn't want Jews from Eastern Europe. They didn't want people from Southern Europe, like Italy. These were all considered the unwashed masses. And so those people didn't really have a chance to get out. They didn't have a chance to be rescued as such. But there were, and Canada was obviously no better. It probably was actually worse. As many of you probably have read the book None is Too Many by Irving Abella and Harold Troper. It describes the Canadian government's attitude toward immigration and quotes an immigration official in the government who basically says, in response to accepting any Jews, he says, none is too many. Basically didn't want any. And William Lyon Mackenzie was not certainly a friend of the Jews and did not support opening the doors to immigration for Jews from any part of Europe, in fact. But as the years went on and conditions for Jews in Germany in particular, and Austria and Czechoslovakia, and later in Europe got worse, the more enlightened countries recognized that there was a serious problem. And they attempted to address the problem by establishing a conference, which doesn't always really work that well. So we have the Evian Conference, which takes place in July of 1938. And things have gotten quite bad for Jews in Germany in particular, and for Austria, where the Anschluss has already taken place. And the conference is a terrible failure. Of the 32 countries who attended, one country initially agreed to accept a number of Jews, and that was a country that we wouldn't necessarily expect to have accepted Jews, and that was the Dominican Republic. Part of that was the dictator in the Dominican Republic thought the Jews could help the economy of the country. Another country that later agreed to accept some Jews was Costa Rica. But other than that, countries like Canada, Great Britain, United States was unwilling to accept, Australia, etc., were unwilling to accept any significant number of Jews as refugees from the Nazi Third Reich regime. And things kept getting worse. Of course, in 1938, in November, we have Kristallnacht, which is really the real beginning of the Holocaust in a sense. And at that point, it becomes apparent that at least something needs to be done. At least some governments step forward and are prepared to take some action. And the first government that really steps forward to take action is the British government. There's debates in Parliament about accepting refugees from Germany and Austria and Czechoslovakia. And eventually, Parliament agrees to accept 10,000 children without their parents and no adults. And basically the top age was 16 or 17. And they would come by rail to the English Channel and would be transported over by boat to England. They would have to be supported by the Jewish community. And one of the other conditions was that they could not stay in Great Britain after any war breaks out and it's completed. So basically it was a temporary shelter for these children. So 10,000 children actually make it to England as part of the kinder transport. And you can imagine what this was like for both child and parents who were being separated. In the case of the parents, it's quite possible they believe that they would never see their children again, given what the circumstances in Europe were. And for the children, depending on their age, some would be aware of what was going on, some would be less aware or not aware at all, depending on how young they were. And so some of them probably did not recognize that this might be the last time that they see their parents. But 10,000 children did make it to Great Britain and were able, as a result, to survive the war, either being accepted into homes of Jewish families in Great Britain or taken up by other families. Some were treated well, some were treated less well, but they were safe from the war in the continent. There were individuals who also took it upon themselves to try to save children. And obviously the most famous one is Nicholas Winton, a British businessman who takes it upon himself to go to Czechoslovakia to try to save children in Czechoslovakia. And he ultimately is successful. He's unhappy by the number he's able to save, but is able to save 669 children who again make it to Great Britain and are obviously able to survive the war. Among the 10,000 children in the kinder transport, there are many famous people, but let me just talk about a few from who were saved by Nicholas Winton. Winton saved the following people. Some of you will probably recognize the names of some of them. Joe Schlesinger, who was a longtime CBC correspondent, was on Winton transport to Great Britain. Alfred Bader, now that's a name you may not be familiar with. Bader turned out to be a very successful Canadian businessman. He married a woman whose name was Isabel. And those of you who are familiar with the Isabel Bader Theater, it's named after Alfred Bader's wife. The Baders were very strong philanthropists. He obviously had a very successful business career. He was saved by transport arranged by Nicholas Winton. Walter Cohen was a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry. He was also one of the children saved by Winton. There's an artist, a sculptor by the name of Frank Meisler. I mention him because Meisler eventually ends up in Israel, but he is the creator of two sculptures in honor of the Kindertransport. One is at Liverpool Station in London, which was the final destination of these Kindertransports before the kids were sent off to their homes. And there's a similar statue at the Friedrichstrasse station in Berlin, which is the departure point for the Kindertransport in Germany. I mentioned somebody last week when we were talking about music, a fellow by the name of Helmut Kuhlmann. He was somebody who worked in the National Library in Ottawa, and is the author of the Encyclopedia of Canadian Music, and is a very influential individual in respect of the history of Canadian music. And then there were a couple of others that I wanted to mention. Alfred Penzias was another Nobel Prize winner, this time in physics. And one of the professors I had when I was studying in Oxford, Gunther Treidel, was another one of the individuals on a Winton transport. So these transport not only saved the lives of many children, but they actually helped us in many different ways with these Nobel Prize winners and artists and intellectuals. So they made a huge contribution to, in most cases, in the Kindertransport and the Winton transport to Great Britain in the post-war years. The US tried to duplicate the British proposal and effort to transport children to safety. There was a bill drafted to be introduced into Congress that would have resulted in 20,000 children being accepted as immigrants to the United States. Given the level of anti-Semitism in the United States at the time, and given the fact that the Americans were coming out of the Depression, the bill received little or no support. It didn't actually even get introduced into Congress as a bill to be debated. It was sidelined even before it got to that point. So we obviously have a number of children who are saved. There are many children saved during the war. We're going to talk about that in a little while. But we have to recognize that, and the statistic is the one that's used all the time, 1.5 million children died in the Holocaust. So if you think about the kinds of individuals I just mentioned saved by Nicholas Winton, think about 1% of 1.5 million and what those children might have contributed to our world. They may have been the person responsible for even finding a vaccine for our present COVID-19. Who knows? But we lost that opportunity because there were no countries willing to accept these children, and ultimately they were killed by the Nazi machine. There were other efforts to save Jews before the war broke out. One of the most famous is the effort by a musician, a conductor by the name of Bronislaw Huberman, who is a Zionist, and he convinces about 1,000 musicians to move to Palestine before the war. And the musicians he saves through that effort, many of them became the backbone of the later to be Israeli Philharmonic. They became first members of the Palestine Symphony Orchestra, and then later members of the Israeli Philharmonic. So there are a couple of other efforts I want to mention in the pre-war period that are also quite significant. Again, they're sort of like the efforts to save the scientists by the Americans. We have something called the Academic Assistance Council in Great Britain, who are keen to try to save as many scientists and academics as possible. They end up saving more than 1,000 by finding positions for them at British universities and some in other places. And just to see how important their efforts were, from those that they saved, 16 were awarded a Nobel Prize. More than 100 became members of either the Royal Society or the British Academy, and 18 of them were knighted by the King or the Queen. So a very incredibly successful effort to save, as I said, intellectuals and academics. And again, among those, there are some names that you might be familiar with. I mentioned Ludwig Guttmann when we were talking about athletes. He's the fellow who basically invented the Paralympic Games. He was saved through the Academic Council. He is one of the people who was knighted by the Queen much later. Max Born is a quantum mechanics specialist. He's saved as well. And then we have Otto Kahn Freund, who is a labor law specialist, who I believe also taught at Oxford. Sir Bernard Katz is another Nobel Prize winner. Max Perutz is another Nobel Prize winner. And A.B. Sachs, whose name might be familiar to you. A.B. Sachs was an activist in South Africa against the apartheid. He was a friend of Nelson Mandela. He, in his activities, and he was really an activist because he was making bombs. He loses an arm in one of these efforts. He later, after Mandela comes to power, is appointed as a judge in the new South Africa. The Americans had a similar operation, not quite as successful as the British one, but they again saved about 300 academics. Interestingly enough, you might be familiar with the fact that the University of Berkeley Law School is one of the best law schools in the world. The University of Berkeley, California, was a backwater university until the 30s. And they really built their reputation on the number of academics they were able to bring in from Europe before the war started. So Berkeley itself really owes its reputation in large part to those emigre academics who came from Europe and joined the faculties at Berkeley. So that's basically the major efforts during the pre-war period. Now I'm going to move into the war period, the period from 1939 to 1945, when obviously rescue becomes much more difficult. Certainly as the war begins, the first country that's invaded is Poland. And within a year, all of Western Europe comes under the control of Germany, other than the neutral countries, which I'll talk about in a minute. And eventually, throughout that period, almost all of Europe is conquered by the Nazis until basically the Allies are able to push back first on the Eastern Front and then on the Western Front with the invasion on D-Day in 1944. There are a number of individuals who merit a special mention in the period during the war. One of them is a fellow by the name of Varian Fry, who's in his 30s, and he is stationed in France. And he is involved with a body called the Emergency Rescue Committee, which has the support of the president's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. And his job is to try to ferret out from France into the neutral countries of Portugal and Spain, artists and intellectuals who are deemed to be worthy of being saved. And he is quite successful. He eventually is able to save about 2,000 people doing that. And again, there are many illustrious names. If you go on Wikipedia and look up his name, they'll have a list of about 50 of, or maybe more, of the people that he saved, but here's just a highlight of some of the people he saved. Hannah Arendt is one of those. Jean Arp, who's a famous artist and sculptor. Marc Chagall, who I'm sure you're familiar with. Marcel Duchamp, a surrealist artist of a sort. Arthur Koestler, who's famous for his novel Darkness at Noon. Jacques Lipchitz, who's a sculptor, and if you've been to Yad Vashem, you will be familiar with his large, long sculpture, which sort of looks like barbed wire. That's a product of Jacques Lipchitz. Just as a side note, just read an article this morning which informed me that there is a movie being made about Berrien Fry's life or his efforts to save Jews. It's going to be called Crown Thy Good. And as I said, Berrien Fry is a very important person. He's ultimately recognized as a righteous among the nations, as you'd expect, for his efforts in saving the lives of about 2,000 people. Another person who's probably not quite as well known, and maybe it's because of his intelligence background, Frank Foley was a member of the British intelligence fellows, and he is stationed in Germany, and he is passing himself off as a passport control officer, in which capacity he is able to issue visas to individuals to get out of Germany. And he is credited with saving about 10,000 lives by his efforts to get people out through his position as passport control officer, first in Germany and then later in Norway. He's a very modest man. He doesn't make a big deal about his service to his country, but he is really an incredibly important individual in the history of the Second World War, because in addition to his rescue efforts, he is one of the people involved in the operation called Double Cross. And Double Cross is the operation which led to the Germans believing that the D-Day invasion would take place not in Normandy, but further north and away from that part of the coast. And the Double Cross obviously worked, because when the invasion occurred, they didn't expect it to be where it was, where eventually it landed. And of course, during the war, after the war starts, many people in the eastern part of Europe, as Poland, and in the Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia parts of Eastern Europe, they recognize what's going on. By the time the war starts, of course, there is a disclosure of the Ribbentrop and Molotov Pact, which divided Poland in half, gave the eastern part of Poland to the Soviets. So those people immediately became part of the Soviet Union. But even those in the part that was under the control of, or became under the control of Germany, tried to make it to the Soviet part. Many of those people were saved by being sent to Siberia. I have a friend whose parents were sent to Siberia and spent the war years in Siberia. Not the best place, but at least you got to survive the war. Many of the Jews in Eastern Europe also went to the stands, as I call them, to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, all those places where they were able, again, to survive the war mostly in safety. So that's sort of the big efforts to save Jews during the early part of the war. Obviously, at some point, Berrien Fry has to leave Europe because he's constantly under suspicion by the Germans. Frank Foley similarly has to leave. He eventually goes to Norway and then eventually gets back to Britain. Being involved in the rescue of Jews is a very dangerous business, especially when the Germans start the war. It's made clear to the population in all the countries that they invade that if you are found to be hiding, aiding, or helping Jews to escape, you are at risk of being executed. And there were certainly a number of people who tried to help Jews and hid Jews who were in fact executed by the Germans. And this was the policy throughout Europe occupied by the Nazis. Perhaps the worst story is one of the earliest stories. It's the story of a Polish family by the last name of Ulam. The Ulam family consists of 2 parents and 6 children. They are hiding Jews in their property, which is in the rural part of the country. They are eventually found out, I think, as a result of a neighbor telling on them. And when they are discovered, the Nazis basically execute the parents first, despite the pleas of the parents to not kill the children in front of their eyes. They do get executed as parents first, and the children watch their parents being executed, and the 6 children are then also shot by the Nazis and executed. So, as I said, rescue is a very risky business. Now, who were the rescuers? Did they have any special traits or features? Well, I think that's a pretty hard question to answer. I think what we do know is the rescuers came from all walks of life. There were members of royalty like Princess Alice, the mother of Prince Philip, who was a rescuer who hid Jews. She was recognized as a righteous among the nations. And then many peasants, farmers, people who lived in rural areas, they agreed to hide Jews. There were people who were people in the city versus people in the country. There were people who were religious. There were people who were not religious. There were people who were of all religious stripes. So there were Catholics, there were Lutherans, there were Huguenots, and there were Muslims. All of these individuals saved Jews. Yad Vashem, as you know, has this category of righteous among the nations, which was created in the early 1960s. And up to this past year, there were just over 27,500 individuals and organizations and countries recognized as righteous among the nations. Most of the people recognized are in fact individuals, but there are some exceptions. There is the country of Denmark. Denmark as a country is recognized as a righteous among the nations, even though obviously it required individuals to rescue Jews, but of course there's the famous story of there's some suggestion that they're forewarned that transports of the Jews are going to start from Denmark. The information was leaked by a Nazi officer. That's this one story. And that results in the country mobilizing to save their Jews. They're hidden until they can be transported out of the country. And then of the 7,500 Jews who live in Denmark, approximately 7,000 are saved, mostly through the armada of little fishing boats and others who transport these individuals to Sweden for safety, Sweden being a neutral country and not occupied by the Germans. There are a couple of villages that are recognized for their efforts. Probably the most famous is the village of Chambon-sur-Lignon in the part of Vichy, France, known as the Plateau. It was a village of 5,000 people. It's estimated that the villagers who all agreed to help the Jews and not to out them to the Germans, it's estimated that they saved 5,000 Jewish lives. It's a little bit like the story of Come From Away. Obviously, it's in much more severe circumstances, but you'll know in Come From Away, the 7,000 people in Gander, Newfoundland, basically housed for 4 days, 7,000 people who would land there on an emergency basis during 9/11. But in these villages like Chambon-sur-Lignon, it's not just 4 days, it's for years in some cases. People being hidden and then efforts made to have them cross over into either Switzerland or into Portugal and Spain and Portugal. And then it's also important to recognize that the righteous among the nations come from the 4 corners of the earth. There are obviously many from Europe, some from Asia, some from North America, very few, none from Canada, about 5 from the United States, Barry and Fry being one of them, and a number from South America. So among the 27,500, the largest number comes from Poland, where there are almost 7,000 righteous among the nations recognized. Second largest number is from the Netherlands, where there's around 6,000, and about 4,000 from France. France is not a surprise because there was a large resistance movement. The Netherlands, there was obviously a large resistance movement, otherwise you wouldn't have that number. But there were also many collaborators with the Nazis in the Netherlands. So that number becomes extremely important to recognize their efforts to save Jews in the light of those circumstances. I want to turn to a special category of individuals, perhaps not as at greater risk as the ordinary individual who we think of as a rescuer. These are the diplomats working in the various embassies and consulates in different countries throughout Europe. These diplomats had the power to grant visas to individual Jews or families to allow them to obtain protection from the Nazis and also to be able to leave wherever they were found and to go to some other safer place. It's estimated that over 250,000 people were saved by the diplomats in Europe. And you probably are familiar with some of their stories. Obviously, we are all probably familiar with the story of Raoul Wallenberg, whose great efforts to save Jews was really restricted to the Jews in Hungary in 1944, when the Nazis marched into Hungary to take over for the otherwise fascist regime that was in place there. And in a short period of time, in the summer of 1944, the Nazis are able to transport over 400,000 Jews to the death camps, mainly to Auschwitz. Raoul Wallenberg and a couple of other people working with him, other diplomats as well, were able to save at least 100,000 Jews through their efforts to provide them with protection, provide them with hiding places and safe houses. He's probably the best known diplomat involved in these rescue efforts, and he, of course, is recognized as a righteous among the nations. And he is recognized in many different countries. He's been honored, for example, in our own Earl Bales Park. I think the street leading into the park is called Raoul Wallenberg Avenue. There's a street named after him in New York. He has statues in a number of different places. He is very well known. Others a little bit less known, but still quite well known, is the Consulate General in Kovna, what's now Kaunas in Lithuania, who was a Consul General for Japan. His name is Shikun Sugihara, and he ends up issuing visas to Jews to allow them to travel to Japan. Now, how do you get to Japan from Kovna, Lithuania? The easiest way, most expensive way, the longest way is to travel through Russia. And that's how they did it. They traveled on the train going to Vladivostok, taking the boat from Vladivostok to Japan. Their only hitch in this plan was that the visas allowed them to get to Japan, but did not allow them to stay in Japan. So Sugihara basically partnered with another diplomat working in the same area, a man by the name of Jan Schwartzendijk, who happens to be working for the Netherlands government, the Dutch government. And one of their colonies is a place called Curaçao in the Caribbean. Ironically, it's the place where there's the first and oldest synagogue in the New World. And he arranges for the Jews who are able to get visas from Sugihara to get also a visa to allow them to travel to Curaçao. And so a number of Jews are saved that way. The Chinese ambassador in Vienna, a man by the name of Ho Feng Shan, is responsible for the escape of probably thousands of Jews from Vienna to Shanghai. They're able to get to, as long as they can get out of Austria, out of Vienna, they will be allowed to enter into Shanghai without any special permit, because Shanghai is an open city without any restrictions on who can enter into the city. And so ultimately, during the course of the war, there are already Jews living in Shanghai. There's a large, wealthy Jewish population in Shanghai of Iraqi, Russian, and Iranian Jews. that population was almost doubled during the course of the war, with about 20,000 Jews coming from Europe to Shanghai and survived the war in Shanghai. And as I mentioned last week, that included musicians. One of them was Ferdinand Adler, who helped train some of the founding members of the Chinese Symphony Orchestra. But I want to tell you, I want to focus on a couple of diplomats and diplomatic groups because they have been in the news most recently. The one I want to concentrate on is a fellow by the name of Aristide de Sousa Mendes. He's probably not a diplomat, a rescuer that you've heard a great deal about. He's a diplomat working in Bordeaux, France, which is in Vichy, France, during the course of the war. He comes from a fairly wealthy family. And just before and after the Nazis invade France, he falls into a deep depression for 3 days because he knows he has to do something to help the people who are clamoring at his door to get visas to get out of France and into Portugal through Spain. And after his 3 days of lying in bed, trying to figure out what to do, he decides, come hell or high water, he's going to help as many people as he can, knowing that his government has forbidden him from issuing visas to all kinds of groups of people, but especially to Jews. Despite that, as I said, he goes on a tirade issuing as many visas and documents that he can to help people to get out of France through Spain and into Portugal. And it's estimated that he certainly saved more than 3,500 people because those people have been identified. It's estimated he may have saved as many as 10,000. At least he issued documents in and around that amount. But he came to a sad fate after he returned or was recalled by the Portuguese government because he had actually broken his obligations to the country by doing something which he was specifically forbidden to do generally. And when he asked for instructions about whether he could do this, he was told in no uncertain terms that he shouldn't do it. So he's recalled. He loses his position in the foreign service. He leads a life of poverty, really. After that, he and his family are not very well off. And he is basically disowned by the Portuguese government. He's not really recognized as having done anything very special. All of that starts to turn around in the 1980s when, and it has to be remembered that Portugal, up until the mid-70s, was a dictator, and it was the dictator who had specifically ordered him not to permit to give visas to Jews. When the democratic government takes over in the mid-70s, things change. By 1988, his record is expunged. He is, in 1997, recognized as the greatest hero of Portugal in the 20th century for his actions in saving Jewish lives. He has a playground named after him in the city of Toronto, near the Cedar Vale Ravine in something called the Arlington Parquet, which is attached to the Cedar Vale Ravine. His house becomes a museum in Portugal in a small village where he lived. And this, just a few weeks ago, there was a cenotaph raised to him in the Pantheon in Portugal, recognizing his efforts to save the Jews stuck in Europe and to come to safety through Spain, as I said, and Portugal. And in fact, when he is recalled, he leaves with a number of refugees going through Spain and making it to Portugal. There's a new book that's just been written about his efforts, which came out earlier this year. The book is called Hitler's Jewish Refugees, Hope and Anxiety in Portugal. And again, it must be remembered in the context of Portugal, Portugal was a country that threw its Jews out during the course of the Inquisition in the 1600s. So this is a huge turnaround in the Portuguese-Jewish relationship. So let me mention some, the other diplomatic group is called the Bernese Group. The Bernese Group is a group of diplomats operating in Bern, Switzerland. The group is not all diplomats. There are 3 Polish diplomats, and there are 3 Jews who are working with this group of diplomats to obtain passports into, or visas into Switzerland or out of Europe, arranged by this group. And it's done through, very typical fashion in these circumstances, frauds and forgeries and fake passports and fake IDs, which the Jewish members of the group are instrumental in providing. And again, they save at least 3,000 individuals through their efforts. Their story really only comes to light about 3 or 4 years ago. The leader of the diplomatic corps there, the head of the Bernese group, has been recognized as a righteous among the nations. The other 2 members of the diplomatic office were not so recognized. And as a result, the son of the diplomat who has been recognized has refused to accept his citation from Yad Vashem until the other 2 are equally recognized for their efforts. Yad Vashem took the position that his father was the leader of the group and that's why he should be recognized, but the son is not accepting that. And so, yes, he has been recognized, the other 2 have not, and that's their story. So there's been a lot of press about them in the last year in particular. So if you go on Google, look up the Bernese group, you can read about their story. Now, I mentioned that there were 3 members of this group who were Jewish. None of them are recognized as righteous among the nations. And there's a simple reason for that. Jews are not recognized by Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations. In order to be recognized, you had to be not Jewish, and you had to have risked your life in saving Jews, or rescuing Jews, and you had to have done it without any benefit or compensation. So Jews who help Jews have not been recognized by Yad Vashem. And so people like Nicholas Winton, who Yad Vashem considers to be Jewish because of his mother's side, is not recognized as a righteous among the nations in Yad Vashem. Another person who might be of interest to you is a woman who is a doctor and who is imprisoned in Auschwitz. She is looking after the women in the hospital in Auschwitz, and there was a hospital, and she is approached by Mengele to advise him if there are any women in the camp who are pregnant, and he will look after them. And she knew what looking after them meant. So what she decided to do was she decided that if any woman approached her and told her that she was pregnant, that she would provide them with an abortion so that they would not have the child. They would not be put at risk by Mengele, or certainly the child would not be put at risk. And you might ask, how did women get pregnant? Well, there was some fraternization in some times by men and women, but there were also Nazi guards that took advantage of women. And so that's how some of them became pregnant. So she also, being Jewish, was not is not recognized as a righteous among the nations. She eventually moved to Israel and then eventually to the United States, where she continued to practice for many, many years after the war. I want to now turn to another group which has been labeled the Marcel Network. The Marcel Network is basically headed by 2 young Jews, a man and a woman, with the assistance of a couple of priests. And their efforts is to, again, save children, as many children as they can, from being killed by the Nazis. So we have a short video to explain who the Marcel Network was and what they did.
Hello, I'm Fred Coleman, and I'd like to tell you about my new book, The Marcel Network. It's a true story, never been told before, about a very special young couple in Nice during the German occupation of France. He was a graduate student. She was just out of medical school. It was World War II, and life was just about as tough as it can get. For them, a whole meal could be only a hard-boiled egg, and even a shared cigarette was a luxury. Worse, like all other Jews, the threat of the gas chambers hung over their heads. And yet, improbably, these two remarkable people stood up against the atrocities. They risked their lives day after day against overwhelming odds. They defied one of the most brutal dictatorships in history, and they succeeded in saving the lives of 527 children from the Holocaust. As an example of what only two people of goodwill can accomplish in the face of crimes against humanity, their story is a lesson for all time. It is as relevant in today's world trouble spots as it was in Hitler's day. Musa Abadi, a recent immigrant from Syria, was only 33 years old, and Odette Rosenstock, his French companion and future wife, was only 28 when they formed the Marcel Network. With the help of a Catholic bishop and two Protestant pastors, they hid children in Catholic convents and boarding schools or with Protestant families. By the end of the war, their clandestine network was one of the most successful operations of Jewish resistance anywhere in Europe.
So here again, you have a couple of Jews who are not, as I said, recognized for their efforts because they are Jewish, and Yad Vashem only recognizes non-Jewish rescuers. Some Jewish organizations have tried to correct that approach and have created organizations that recognize Jewish rescuers. B'nai B'rith is one of those organizations. And again, you can find information about the organization and their efforts. Individuals who are recognized receive a special citation, a number, and the organization is really only created, and the recognition only has been around for about a decade. So there haven't been all that many individuals recognized in that way, but there's a lot of research being conducted to determine who the many Jewish rescuers are that have not been recognized or written about in any great detail after the war. Now we get to the point where I want to talk about some people who aren't typically considered to be rescuers, but should be. The one I want to talk about first is somebody who clearly is recognized as a rescuer, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the others. There's an American member of the Army by the name of Roddy Edmonds. Roddy Edmonds was only recently, I think in 2015 or 2016, recognized as a righteous among the nations, despite the fact that his rescue resulted in the saving of 200 Jewish lives. And the video will tell you the story, and if it doesn't tell you enough, I will fill in. So here's the video explaining about the efforts of Roddy Edmonds, an American sergeant and the most senior officer in a POW camp.
Sorry about that, 1 second.
Now, Roddy Edmonds' actions might suggest that he had the chutzpah of a Jew, but to think that he could get away with refusing the orders of a Nazi commandant is surprising. What's equally surprising is he doesn't tell his story to his family or his children. They eventually unearth the story themselves. They have some idea that he did something special, but they don't really know the details. And the story only comes out much later after he's died. If you want to see a wonderful presentation of the recognition to someone who is a righteous among the nations, you can look on the internet for the speech given by Barack Obama at the event where Roddy Edmonds is recognized as a righteous among the nations. The award obviously is given to his family and not to him because he's passed away. But it highlights the importance of this event. Roddy Edmonds is only the 5th American to ever be recognized as a righteous among the nations, and it was clearly an important event for President Barack Obama at the time the award was made. Edmonds, in a sense, is a liberator, but I'm going to talk a little bit about some actual liberators. Again, people don't usually think of the liberators as rescuers, but of course they were rescuers. Had they not arrived when they did, many more Jews in the camps or in other places would have died. One of the people I want to mention, he's not recognized as a rescuer, but he is the commanding officer first to enter Bergen-Belsen. His name is Leonard Bernay. Like a lot of soldiers who were involved in the liberation of the camps, they didn't talk very much about it. And you can understand why. This was an incredibly, I would guess, traumatic event to see people reduced to almost a subhuman condition. Leonard Bernay did not talk about what he did in freeing Bergen-Belsen, what he did after the camp was freed and the individuals there had to be saved as best they could, until he was in his 80s. And in his 80s, he started to speak about his experiences in the army, and especially as a liberator at Bergen-Belsen. And he did so for one main reason. He was so upset at the idea that people could deny the existence of the Holocaust. And so he started to speak to groups and children and adults. And he continued to do that almost till he died. He died at the age of 95. When he liberated Bergen-Belsen, he was in his 20s. So he lived with this story in silence for 60 years. And we talked about it in the last 10 years of his life. But it clearly impacted him greatly. So that's one story. And then I'm going to tell you the story of some American soldiers who become accidental rescuers or liberators. It's the story of the American servicemen who come upon a train in the middle of nowhere, and they don't really realize what the train is until they start to open the doors of the cattle cars. So here's the story of the train near Magdeburg.
I remember that the train's in the middle of a forest, and everybody panicked. Everybody felt that this is the place where they're going to come and kill us all. And sure enough, we heard a rumble of a tank. And then the turret opened, and a soldier popped out, and my father yelled, "Americans."
The response to seeing that star on the green painted tank and Jeep is one of unbridled joy for those survivors who are not too young to understand what it meant. It meant liberation. It meant that they were now safe. Good to have you ahead of me a little bit. Walter's at the tables. Go sit down.
We're here.
Yep. There he is.
There is my friend. Maybe my son. So good to see you.
I never dreamt that this would happen someday.
Well,
Yeah,
it
but
happened thanks to
life is.
thanks to a couple of great gentlemen.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're coming to the post-war period. And you might think, well, there's not much rescuing that needs to be done in the post-war period, but of course, the fact that the war has ended doesn't mean that everybody is safe. And I just want to take a few more minutes, because I know I'm over time. I want to tell you a little bit about my view of rescuing in the post-war period. There are clearly some stories that I would consider to be rescues. I don't have time to play you the video of the Windermere boys. We're going to skip that. But it's a story of an airlift of orphans who've survived the war. The airlift is of just over 700 children who are orphaned. Their parents are no longer alive. And they are brought to England, and they're brought to England by pilots of the RAF who volunteer their services to bring these orphans to England to recover and rehabilitate after their experiences in the war. One of the Windermere boys is a child by the name of Ben Helfgott, who I mentioned when we talked about athletes. He became a weightlifting champion. He went to the Olympics. He was one of the boys. The boys weren't just boys. There were about 80 girls and the 700 plus children airlifted to the UK. I want to also, at the end, I'm going to talk about a story involving what are called the rabbits of Ravensbrück. Before I do that, I think it's important to also understand that rescue can obviously involve live individuals, but I think for the Jewish community, it's equally important to rescue those who died. How do you rescue somebody who's died? You rescue them by keeping their name alive. And you do that, and we've done that in various places and in various different ways through memorials. My parents' Landsmannschaft, there's a Glenmuir Society, has a monument up at Bathurst Lawn where the names of the family members of the members who survived is etched in the monument there. If you go to the Shoah monument in Paris, you will see the names of the 70,000 plus Jews who were murdered by the Nazis during the Second World War. You will find similar monuments in other places. Amsterdam is about to erect its monument, or has erected its monument in the same form. And Vienna is about to construct a monument, again, listing the names of all of those Jews of Austria who were killed during the war by the Nazis. So people rescue their survivors, the relatives of their survivors who were killed by keeping their names alive. There's an effort at Yad Vashem now on every Yom HaShoah to read out the names of some of those who died, to keep their memory alive. The Jewish communities who were obliterated in Poland and in other places have kept the memory of their community alive by publishing Yisker books after the war. There are approximately 900 Isker books that were published in that way. They're all housed at the library at Yale. And Yad Vashem obviously is keeping all of the names of those who were killed alive at Yad Vashem. And there's still an effort to find what are believed to be the missing 1.5 million or so. Interestingly enough, the pandemic has resulted in a number of volunteers volunteering to look at documents at Bad Arolsen, which is the repository of the Nazi documents recovered after the war, to find additional names that haven't yet been discovered. And up to this point, they've already recognized or added 130,000 names to the names that were already known. So the last story I want to tell you is the story of the rabbits of Ravensbrück. And again, it's a story that most people don't know. I didn't know it until I started to prepare for talks like this. It's a story of the rescue of not Jews, non-Jews. It's a rescue after the war, and it's the story of the rabbits of Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück, like Auschwitz, was a place where medical experiments were conducted. After the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, who died not of the wounds at the hands of his assassins, but of gangrene from the wounds that he suffered, Hitler decided it was important to try to develop drugs to help save German soldiers who were shot or injured, but not killed by bullets. And so they conducted experiments with sulfa, and one of the places where they conducted these experiments was in Ravensbrück, which, as you may know, was a camp for women. Many Polish women and women from a lot of other different countries as well, and Jews. So these women were the subject matter of experiments where they cut into their legs and then put debris of all kinds into their wounds and treated them with sulfa drugs to see which drugs might help them recover from or keep them alive after the wounds and the dirt put into their wounds. And some died and some survived. And after the war, they were liberated, but they had been, in some respects, crippled by these experiments. They're called the rabbits of Ravensbrück because of the way they had to walk after these experiments. They sort of hopped along with one leg, and therefore they were called the rabbits of Ravensbrück. The story of the rabbits becomes known to an American socialite by the name of Carolyn Faraday, who learns about the story and she's been a philanthropist her whole life. She was an actress for a time, but came from a wealthy family and became a philanthropist. And she wanted to save the rabbits of Ravensbrück, or help them at least. And ultimately she creates a great effort to bring over as many of the rabbits as they can to the United States. They're provided with free medical treatment. They are basically hosted from coast to coast. And at the same time, she engages a lawyer by the name of Benjamin Ferencz, who again, you may be familiar with. He was a 26 or 27-year-old prosecutor at one of the Nuremberg trials to get them compensation. And the long and short of the story is that the rabbits of Ravensbrück are treated as royalty in the United States. They're showered with gifts by American corporations. They're given free medical treatment, and many of them are helped a great deal from the medical treatment they receive. A number of them fall in love and stay in America. Most of them return to Poland, but it's a great story. It's the subject matter of a book called The Lilac Girls, and so we're going to give you a little clip by somebody involved in the book, and it's the subject matter of a documentary that they're trying to raise funds for, which I don't think they've fully succeeded yet, but it's an amazing story and it's a really interesting book. The book is called The Lilac Girls.
My novel, Lilac Girls, is based on a true story of how philanthropist Caroline Faraday brought a group of Polish survivors of a concentration camp to the United States. My journey writing Lilac Girls all started here at the Bellamy Faraday house, this beautiful summer home of the Faraday family that Caroline called the Hay. I carried around a clipping in my wallet for months from Victoria magazine. The title of it was Caroline's Incredible Lilacs, and it showed her beautiful garden that she and her mother had planted. I thought, I need to see this house. One gray Mother's Day after my mother died, my husband said, I'll take care of the kids. You go up to that house. And I did. And I came up here and I was the only person on the tour that day. And I was so lucky because I got to ask every question. And I fell in love with Caroline just walking around her home. She worked at the French consulate in New York during the war. She set up a whole organization that supported orphan children of French resistance fighters. And after the war, France awarded her the French Legion of Honor and the Cross of Lorraine. Caroline used her old manual Remington typewriter as a weapon. She was very vocal about civil rights. She started the first Black bank in Harlem. She sought out injustices around the world, and she used correspondence to make sure people knew about it. At the end of the tour, you come out to the landing outside of Caroline's bedroom and see her desk just as she left it. And there was a photograph of smiling middle-aged women. And I asked the tour guide, who are those people? And she said, oh, those are the rabbits. They were Polish women that were operated on at Ravensbrück concentration camp, Hitler's only all-female concentration camp in Germany, to test sulfa drugs. And the Nazis not only used them as their laboratory animals, but after the experiments, the women hopped about the camp. So the Nazis nicknamed them the rabbits. Caroline Faraday heard about them through her French friends and brought them to the United States. She rallied America behind them with the help of Norman Cousins at the Saturday Review and brought them to the United States for rehabilitation. Several of them actually stayed here. They were lucky enough to stay with Caroline. So once I heard that story, I couldn't get it out of my head, and I had to learn more about Caroline. I went on a 10-year journey to find any clue that I could find about not only Caroline, but the rabbits as well.
Okay, let me just fill you in one other aspect of the story of the rabbits of Ravensbrück, and then I understand I have a question, which I will address. It's a story of rescue after the war in the way that you've just heard, but it's also in part a story of rescue during the war. In the last 3 months of the war, the inmates at Ravensbrück recognized that the Germans were likely to take the rabbits of Ravensbrück and have them killed so they would destroy the evidence of the medical experiments. So for the last 3 months of the war, the other inmates did what they could to hide these women who had been the subject matter of experiments and to ensure that they were not found by the commanders of the camp and then killed. And they were quite successful in their efforts to do so. So it's a story of rescue during the war and after the war in a different sense. So it's quite an amazing story that the inmates did this on their own, and then Caroline Faraday came along later and helped them of her own desire to make sure that they were properly treated and properly looked after from a medical point of view. So thank you very much for listening to the story of the rescuers. I hope you've learned a lot. I've learned a lot doing this research for this talk. And I know that there's at least one question about the Kindertransport, which I will do my best to answer. I don't have an answer to the specific question. The question is, how many of the Kindertransport were reunited with their parents? There were clearly some, but many others, their parents were killed, which is not a big surprise given the number of people killed during the war. I have a cousin who's now deceased, Dora. She was sent by her parents on the Kindertransport, one of the last Kindertransport to leave from Vienna. Her parents both perished during the war, so she was an orphan after the war. Her future husband, Hans, who became John Vernon, was one of the oldest kids on the Kindertransport. He was almost 17. His mother, who was not Jewish, survived the war. And John's story is an interesting one because he later is interned when he turns 18 as an enemy alien for a short period of time, joins the British Army, and he is among the troops that liberated Bergen-Belsen. And he later becomes a translator at Nuremberg for a short period of time after the war. And they lived for many years in England. They eventually moved to Israel to be with their daughter, who's moved to Israel. So their story is not atypical. One story I did come across, because the question is how many of the people looking after the children on the kinder transport refused to give them up. I don't know if that was so true in England. It clearly was true in the other parts of Europe, particularly in the Catholic countries, because many of the Jewish children who were handed over by their parents and their parents did not return were ultimately baptized and raised as Catholics. And they didn't know any better because many of them had been too young to understand that they were Jewish. There's a story of two brothers in France whose relatives, their parents did not survive, but their relatives want to adopt them, and they're not living in France. They're living in, I think, America. And the person who has adopted them refuses to hand them over. And it takes 6 years in a court battle to have these two brothers released to their relatives in the United States. And that story is obviously unusual, but it's not that unusual that it didn't happen on other occasions. We obviously know lots of stories of children who were hidden and their parents didn't return, and they were raised with the people that they were left with, not knowing that their real parents were Jewish. And there are lots of stories like this in Poland where people in their 30s and 40s are discovering that they are in fact Jews. Some of them then becoming quite traditional or becoming practicing Jews to extent, and certainly recognizing their Jewish heritage. And that's sometimes the cost of war. Happy if there are any other questions that I can try to answer.
Everybody's still muted, Eric.
Oh.
But I'm happy to have people email after the lecture is over, and I'll be very, very pleased to forward those questions along to you. I want to take this opportunity again to thank you, and as you call her, your partner in crime, your lovely wife, Judy, for all of the research and the work for making this series possible. We are just absolutely privileged and honored. And as well, the Adult Education Committee for bringing this program forward. And that to that end, I'd like to call now on Lionel Berger for the last word.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Sigal. It's indeed a pleasure for me to say a few words of thanks and express our appreciation to Eric Gertner. I first met Eric in 1980, some 41 years ago. He was at our home on Colonnade Road many times over a number of months. I have very fond memories of sitting around the table in our family room with Michael, Meehan, and Eric, studying various common law subjects. Eric was our tutor, and my wife, Marilyn, was always serving the coffee. At the time, I was preparing to write the transfer exams as a Quebec lawyer to become a member of the Ontario Bar. In seeing Eric on the screen today and hearing him speak, it's interesting and heartwarming to me that I see the same interest in scholarship, the same zest for teaching, the same Menschlichkeit nature that I saw 40 years ago. Over the past many years, Eric has continued to demonstrate his passion for research and his passion for teaching in the legal field and other areas, including, importantly, on Holocaust-related topics. On behalf of Beth Tikva and the Adult Education Committee, echoing what Sigal has said, I would like to express our sincere appreciation and thank you to Eric for giving the 3 lectures. I think all of us who listened really enjoyed your warm, well-researched, and enthusiastic presentations, including your terrific and moving presentation today. And how gracious of you to put in the time, the effort, and the hard work to prepare and deliver the 3 lectures, all at no charge to our shul. Toda Rabbah and Yasher Koach to you, Eric Gertner. A special thank you also to Stan Solomon and our wonderful program director, Sigal. They both worked very closely with Eric and Eric's wife, Judy, to put this program together. And thank you, Judy. Sigal tells me you were instrumental, as she just said, in organizing and coordinating these lectures. And I'm glad the program was so well received. Back to you, Sigal.
Well, amazing. So again, many, many, many thanks. I'm sure that I'm not overstepping too much as I echo the sentiments that I've heard from a few people who have emailed me that we just haven't had enough. So we'll get working on getting Eric to maybe do some other series for us. I know, Professor, you had one idea in particular that we had discussed about potentially doing a film series that might highlight some of the stories coming out of this sad and difficult time.
Mhm.
But as viewers out there, if there are particular subjects of interest that you would like us to present via Eric, please send me an email. You know where to find me, and we'll see what we can make happen in the near future. In the meantime, stay healthy, and thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.